What's up, informed mystics? Welcome back to the High Priestess and the Hierophant. We are your co-host. I'm Drew. That's Erika. And today we have the beautiful Trish from BeanbagHagWag with us. Of course, all of her links will be in the description. And I am going to pass it off to you, Erika, to introduce today's topic.
Sure. So I'm looking at my notes here because I want to mention the questions that are connected to the topic too. So we're going to talk about obstacles to mystical experience. And the three questions we're going to talk about are, let me pull them up because I want to make sure I word them correctly. What obstacles to your mystical path have you personally experienced? How did you overcome those obstacles? How do you continue to keep an authentic spiritual practice alive while dealing with ongoing external challenges to your mystical practice? So those were the questions we came up with. So we invited Trish because we know Trish experienced some major obstacles with her upbringing and her connection to Christianity, Catholicism specifically. But we all recognize that we've had very different experiences that we consider to challenge our ability to really connect with our mystical side and connect with the divine. So does that describe the topic well?
Yeah. And I would say that we did have some similar, I think a lot of the obstacles that we've all experienced and that most people, at least in our society, have experienced may stem from the same places, but they hit us in a different way.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So it's a great topic to have a guest come on, and we love talking with Trish because she's one of our best buddies.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, you've had some really interesting experiences along the way on your path, and we've had these conversations, off a public forum like this privately many times. So it'll be interesting to talk about it with this structure and these questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's get into it, and we'll start with you if you want, Trish. So the first question, what obstacles to your mystical path have you personally experienced?
Well, I'd say the biggest obstacles were exactly that, my very Catholic upbringing. I remember going to church as a small child way back when we had to wear something on our head even. So, yeah. That and going through all the sacraments and basically the biggest factor I found was as a Catholic we're taught to have a fear of God. That's something that they instill in us is loving and fearing this God, which sounds like a bad marriage to me. Really, that was my biggest obstacle. And when it comes right down to it, it was my own fear that is the biggest hurdle. And getting over that fear is when my spiritual path turned around.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Erika?
That's interesting. Well, for me, it's a little bit different. So I grew up in a family where we attended an Anglican, which is Episcopalian, I think, in the U.S. church. So it definitely, the thing about it that I felt was an obstacle was that it was decidedly not mystical. It bordered on kind of almost secular in its approach to Christianity. My dad hated it, but I call it the dry toast of Christianity because it just really didn't stir anything within. It felt like you were just going through motions, but it also came with, a set of, rules, belief systems, boundaries. And then in my household, my parents were both interested in things like mysticism and spirituality, yet I felt like I was discouraged from, because it was a toxic environment, I felt like I was discouraged from having, a personal, internal kind of world and connection. So I had it coming at me from a few different places. And I also wrote down just like growing up in Canada was very different than growing up in the US. And Canada is kind of a lot like the Anglican Church. It's like a macrocosm of the microcosm. It's very secular. And, so you're in this environment where kind of all messages that are coming to you are, that these experiences are not valuable at best. At worst, they're just downright crazy. So that was, I think, for me, that environment that I was in that created a huge number of mystical challenges to mysticism. Sorry. Drew, what were your obstacles? I know your experience was different still.
Yeah, we did not attend church. I went a few times with friends growing up, and I went for a summer with my grandmother to her church when we lived with her, but I was not really overly exposed directly to religion at all. And I would say that one parent was completely closed off to it altogether, while the other parent wasn't necessarily closed off, but there was just no discussion of it for most of my life. It just wasn't a thing. I was the one who would bring it up. And for me, I think that my biggest obstacle, honestly, was just not knowing what to do. Like, I really felt a connection and I really felt called to some kind of spiritual path, but I really had no clue what to do with that. And I was always just kind of groping in the dark. And I do feel like another obstacle for me, if I want to bring it into the present, something that can be an obstacle since I became an adult and really moved into a spiritual path in particular, is seeking community, looking too far outside of myself.
On a more adult level, like I was thinking about kind of foundational experience, I would definitely agree with that. And I think another obstacle for me is when I started to get interested in other spiritual traditions other than the one that I grew up with, like Judaism, Buddhism, and then eventually paganism. At the time, I didn't feel like there was as much information out there because we didn't have, this kind of platform, YouTube. We didn't have the internet back then because, I'm in my mid-40s at this point. So I kind of felt alone in all of it. And when I did go to like the minister at the church, for example, who, seemed to be pretty liberal and seemed to be kind of part of these interfaith groups, I was met with a lack of, support and kind of gently, subtly nudged to stay within that community, which makes sense. So I can relate to the lack of community and just lack of information, I would add to that was out there at the time. What about you, Trish, when you got older?
The lack of community was a big thing for me. Even when I went to a Catholic church, I never really felt part of that community. I never really had any mystical experiences while going to that church, while being a Catholic, because it's frowned upon. You just, even going to confession, there's always somebody between you and God. You really can't have a one-on-one relationship with God without having somebody, a man, of course, in the middle between you and God. Yeah.
It's interesting to me how that differs from the Anglican, I keep calling it Anglican because I'm Canadian, Episcopalian type of experience, where it just felt like God just didn't show up for that party. Like there was it was just nothing there. Like I said, it was going through the motions. So in a sense, it was like they were blocking that connection, but on a different level. It wasn't about that hierarchical kind of somebody's in between. It was just like, they set up this situation where the divine didn't really. I'm sure for other people it felt that way, though. That's the thing, right?
Yes.
Yes. So, but for me, I felt that lack of. But I felt it on a societal level, that kind of being blocked by society as a whole and the church as part of that versus like the priest who's the gatekeeper,
Right.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
Drew, it seems I was going to. Did you have a thought you wanted to share?
No, go
I was
ahead.
going to ask you
No.
about your experience because it seems like you because you didn't have that religious institutional kind of Christian experience. You did have you were able to kind of tune into your mystical experiences more. You just kind of didn't know where to go with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes, well, again, that's the informed piece. And sometimes you need something that's a bit more maybe objective, but you just need something outside yourself to give you context. It's like, what do I do with this what do I do with this? I don't know what this is. And I actually, I find when I brought up community for now, I find that community can hinder my mystical, because if I get too wrapped up in what everybody else is doing or what's gone, I'm not enough in myself, and I need that for the mystical experience.
Right.
But
the wrong
Right.
community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
well, that's true too. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm just going to move into the next question and ask Trish how you came over how did you overcome both that initial, but then how do you actively try to overcome anything that blocks you now?
So to overcome these obstacles, I basically educated myself. I researched lots of different religions, and then I began to be more confident about what I believed in, and the ongoing practices are I'm at a loss for I'm at a loss for words here. Overcoming all those challenges. Just getting into my own head and not listening to what's out there. I really got into a goddess-centered spiritual path. And because the Abrahamic God was so toxic at that point, I totally stuck to a goddess-centered path. I didn't go outside of that. And I became unashamed of my beliefs. And part of it was being more private about my beliefs because there's always a naysayer, But getting more involved in community, the YouTube pagan community in particular, really helped me a lot, knowing that there's so many other people who believe in, other things. Not necessarily the same thing, but bigger other things. That helps me a lot.
It's very validating.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, I've come to a point where I don't need validation anymore. But in the beginning, that was really important for me. Just knowing I wasn't alone.
Definitely.
Yeah.
What about you, Erika?
I think for me, it really, the first steps in overcoming these obstacles was a lot of personal work and a lot of deeper, almost shadow work in a sense of, first of all, even being able to connect with those parts of myself, because I think they were in shadow. I just would have these experiences and I would, not have time for them. I would ignore them. So doing the work where I was creating space for that and, maybe detaching from some relationships in my life that, weren't helping with that were hindering that authenticity. And I think for me, I started by doing a meditation practice, and I created this kind of vacuum in my life because I was doing this very kind of New Age meditation, Eastern style meditation practice where I was working on mindfulness and that kind of thing. And I had kind of a minimalist approach. I actually stopped searching for other spiritual paths because I think on some level I knew I had to do that kind of work first. And once I created that space, something stepped in, the divine stepped in and for me revealed itself to be a pagan, path and pagan goddess specifically path. Goddesses stepped in essentially. So in order to get to that space where I was detached, I had to let go mainly of relationships, but beliefs too, that I had.
It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it really is. It took many years of
Yeah.
trying out different religions and having varying degrees of the same experience I had with Christianity, which in my case was kind of like, this empty echo chamber kind of experience. But yeah, I think, it was worth all that work though, because I finally got to a place where the mystical experiences really became more and more intense and continuous and led me to a mystical path. What about you, Drew? I'd love to hear you talk more about how
So
you
I think it's kind of
overcame.
funny because mine is very different than both of yours, but I can somehow relate to both of you. Because, like, I definitely looked into all kinds of other religions and whatnot before, and none of them fit really. So I just was still kind of floating. And then for me, it was forced upon me, really. Like, I know I just continued to search until I got pneumonia, and I guess I nearly died. And when I came out of that experience, I was just a different person, and I interacted with the world and everything around me in a different way, and I understood it in a different way. And it was just this really traumatic and dramatic thing that happened. But I think that the ultimate answer to this question for me is just acceptance. It was just this, I have to accept that this is, I accept that this is what's happening, and that it's okay. I'm okay. This is how things are supposed to be, and just sort of surrendering to the whole thing and not worrying about not only outside voices, but my own negative inner chatter so much.
That's really interesting. It's like a shamanic initiation, like a near-death experience / shamanic initiation, which often come hand in hand, I would think, where you are pulled into this different perspective, this different experience of your existence. And, I think that would definitely lead to the acceptance piece because it was such a radical shift for you.
There's not many other places to go.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's intense, but it's beautiful. And I mean, I think I had many versions of that throughout my life. They never presented quite as extreme as your experience, but when I looked back, I realized I, was continuously being called to this path. It was just because of the nature of the subtlety of it, it was easier to just dismiss it and try to toe the line.
And I agree with you 100%. I'm not going to get into it in this video. We can talk about it in
Yeah.
in Patreon or in another video. But
Yeah.
I have my own ideas about that, about how these things can happen in a mini scale, and then maybe not so many, and why that might be.
Yeah.
But like I said,
For sure.
that's a conversation for another time.
For sure. And I think for me, like I can resonate with your experience because I had a miscarriage when I was in my mid 30s that pushed all of this forward and kind of created this crisis where I recognized I had to live my life differently. And for me, being who I am, that spiritual aspect of it was huge. And it just kind of pushed that agenda forward. So in a way, I can relate to that a lot, to what you're saying. But it didn't feel like what you're describing. It didn't quite feel the same way.
No, and that's, again, I think everybody has these
Yeah.
experiences. They're just to different degrees, and I
Right.
do believe that there are reasons why they happen.
Right.
And that's of course going to be for the benefit of the person ultimately, right?
Right. Like, to me, it sounds like Trisha's experiences were more related to, like, the community and the societal and the church, and for me, it was, like, more a psychological thing with family and, like, relationships and belief systems. And for you, it was, this shamanic initiation kind of extreme situation where you almost died. So it's just interesting how all roads lead to the same result, though.
Yeah. And it took me years to get where I am today
Yeah.
on this
Yeah.
spiritual journey. I'd say so all of this started happening for me probably 20 or so years ago. And quite frankly, for the first 7 years, I had so many doubts about my beliefs. And And once again, it was just getting over my own fear. And that took a long time.
Right, like Drew feeling like you have to accept it at some point and stop fighting against it.
Yeah.
The fear is the desire to fight against it and push back on it.
And there's such a freedom once you accept it all. And that's when everything just blooms. Yeah.
Right. And I think for the three of us, like part of it is we ended up in a spiritual tradition and with practices that aren't kind of considered normative in society. If we had had a mystical experience that connected us deeper with like the Abrahamic God or something, you know, even New Age or Buddhist, I think it would, on some level, it would be almost easier to accept. But, you know, paganism is even a shade further away than like New Age and Buddhism from mainstream beliefs. So there's that factor too, I think.
Yeah, paganism even leans into sort of the antithesis of, depending on where you go with it. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, we already kind of touched on it, but you know, the last question is about keeping an authentic practice in the face of obstacles outside of ourselves that can hinder our mystical experiences and our paths. So, Trish, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Oh, so yes, I mean, I can honestly say right now my spiritual path is robust. My witchcraft practice is robust. And that's just because I live it every day. I'm confident. I keep my faith. And I don't, I mean, it's been a long time. I don't need validation anymore. I'm free to just do and practice the way I want to, and I don't let anybody get in my way. I am totally out of the broom closet, and I hate to use that term, but everybody understands what that means. I'm not ashamed in any way of my practice. It's beautiful and wonderful, and I'm not angry anymore about what I was taught and my Catholic upbringing. At first, I was so angry about so many things, and I'm not angry anymore. And that is a big thing.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
What about you, Erika?
I think for me, when I was, sorry, I have allergies a little bit. I have the window open, that doesn't help. I was thinking about this question, and I think for me, I wrote that the more mystical experience I have, like the more experiences I have, the more confident I grow. So I can relate to what Trish is saying. The more confident I grow in that channel and that connection. And it's like developing a relationship with a person. Like the deeper the relationships I develop with specific personified deity and the experiences I have, the more confident I become, and the, like Trish said, the less I need, it just rocked my camera, the less I need the validation. So it's like a snowball effect, I think. But also there's like a boundary setting thing where, you know, being more sensitive and recognizing when external influences are coming in that are pulling me away from that intuition and that trust in the connection. And that's an ongoing battle, but it's one that is worth continuing to address and fight, because the results are more of those experiences and a deeper practice, and then more of that confidence. So, yeah.
For me, I have to bring it back to surrender again. So, like, once again, I mean, you ladies both know about this, like, better than anybody other than my husband. But, like, my path shifted greatly not very long ago. And it was very shocking and jarring and totally surprising. But all I could do was, oh, okay, this is what we're doing now. So for me, really staying authentic to my mystical experiences and my path, it's about that acceptance. It's about just always going back to that space, because I find it hard sometimes. I mean, I think anybody who watches my channel knows that I am authentic, and like I share a lot. Like I'm an open book. I don't have any secrets really, but I do struggle with presenting all of my authentic bits to others. on different levels, especially when it comes to my spiritual path, because I've never found a place where, well, that's not true. I found that with you guys. But I mean, in a community, I have never found a place where I was wholly accepted as I was. And it's a shadow I got to work on, but I have these scars from different, like real life communities here in my environment and online, where I have presented myself fully, or sometimes I didn't even present myself fully, but parts of myself I hadn't presented, where it was shown to me that those weren't acceptable. Like I struggle with that part of it. But as far as just being contained within myself, it's that surrender piece. It's just, this is what it is. And it doesn't matter here in this space. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks.
Right. There's that theme of like authenticity. And I think part of what I think when I listen to you talk about your experiences, there's a price we pay for that authenticity. And in some cases, that price is that, we end up choosing to not participate in certain communities because of that. So there's a sacrifice there, but at the same time, like I said, the rewards are wonderful, because at the end of the day, it deepens the relationship you have with self and with the divine. Because I personally believe that in order to reach the divine, we have to, turn within and have that relationship with our higher self and our shadow self in order to get there. So in order to keep that relationship or those relationships healthy and functional, we have to sometimes make sacrifices of external relationships, which I can totally resonate with. And, we're lucky we found a group of people through YouTube. We're not all together physically, but we have a small little community. And I know other pagans have similar groups that they're connected with. And, it's sad that we're not together in the same location, but aren't we lucky we're alive now at a time when we can even do this? Because imagine how alone we would feel if we didn't have that and we were still trying to uphold that level of authenticity and not participate with local groups that didn't resonate. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's worth it. I think the mystical path is not for the faint of heart, and or not for people who aren't willing to make those kinds of sacrifices and be completely authentic, because it demands no less.
And again, well, you just said it. Like there's no way around it, because in order to authentically walk, like there are so many things even in the pagan community where it's like, this is the rules and this is how this looks and this is how you do it. And that's not a mystic's path. Like somebody else doesn't get to tell you the rules. That's not how that works. And I actually think a lot of pagans and witches and, people in general, but especially I am familiar with the pagan witchcraft community. I think there are a lot of them that their paths are mystical, whether they realize it or not. Like they really are on a mystical path.
And some who aren't, and that's okay.
Yeah.
If it's more about community, or it's more, it fulfills them on a what we would consider, more superficial level. And I don't say that in a negative way. I mean, the level of depth people are going to go into on a path like this is going to be different for everyone. But the deeper you go, I think the more you do feel kind of on your own, and, you do have to make those sacrifices. So you're not going to fit in with the bigger communities. You're going to have smaller little communities like we're lucky enough to have.
Yeah. And there is room for all of us, regardless of what we believe.
Oh, for sure.
I find it disheartening sometimes, all the, judgment that goes on in the pagan community alone. There's room for all of us.
Yeah, and maybe we'll jump onto Patreon and continue some of that conversation.
I think so.
We touched on some really important, interesting stuff in this video, and I really appreciate hearing Trish's perspective and always hearing Drew's perspective on all of this. And it's good to feel, even though we all faced obstacles that were so different, that we all faced them and found ways to overcome them and found this beautiful path that we're on.
It's a beautiful thing.
I'm so happy to have had this chat with you ladies. We are at our time limit, so we're going to say goodbye, but I want to encourage anyone who wants to hear more to go check out our Patreon, because we're going to kidnap Trish and take her over there and talk to her some more. So
Thank
thank you for
you.
joining us, Trish. Erika, thank you as always. And until next time, keep exploring.